Welcome and thank you for joining us for this episode in the Fearless Minds research series. Same classrooms, same schools. Inclusive education for young people with disability. I'm Terry Webb from Flinders University's Fearless Minds team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode as we talk today about inclusive school education for young people with disability. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this discussion on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all the nations upon which Flinders operates. This event is delivered as part of our Fearless Minds interview series. Throughout this series, you've met Flinders University's most engaging early to mid-career researchers as they've continued to bring you their latest research from a diverse range of fields. And today, we're fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Julie McMillan, a senior lecturer and researcher at Flinders University who is currently conducting work into inclusivity in South Australian schools. Now, Julie, thank you very much for joining us today. And let's start with, what does inclusive education look like in the context of young people with disability?
Inclusive education looks like inclusive communities in schools where everybody belongs. So usually when we think about inclusive education, we think about including everybody regardless of their difference or their diversity.
Yep.
And we look at inclusive school cultures, inclusive school policy and inclusive school practice.
Cool. So what are the benefits of inclusive education in mainstream settings? I mean, the academic and social outcomes.
So what we know about inclusive education is that when children with disability are educated with their peers in typical classrooms, the expectations for their learning is higher or greater because they're learning the same content with adjustments potentially, some with adjustments, some without, but they're still accessing the same content, the same expectations. And so that raises the expectations and increases their academic outcomes. What we also know is that there are lots of benefits in terms of their social inclusion, both for children with disability and those children without, for all children really, because when children are developing their social skills, their emotional regulation, their interaction skills, who best to learn from than other children who also have those skills and are developing those skills. And there are many more opportunities to interact with children and develop those skills along the way. So the potential for development is greater in an inclusive environment, but also for children and staff and all people at school. There's also a social benefit to those children as well, because we all develop those, have more opportunities to develop those social skills for typical children as well, developing empathy and sort of developing those skills that we want in terms of accepting and understanding everybody in a diverse society. And so what better way to do that than make sure that we're practicing those in school as well. So creating inclusive communities also includes creating inclusive schools, and that means addressing the diversity of everybody in our society in schools.
Well, I mean, if we've got that sort of level of benefits, why is it that in Australia, so many children are taught in specialised schools or in separated classrooms?
There are a number of influencing factors around that. So I probably won't be able to address all of them because, I will be here all day, but I'll try to address a couple of them. And a lot of it is historical. So historically, children with disability were separated and segregated, and then the time that it's taken for us to continue and move on. And then as part of that, we developed separate systems and invested in separate systems, separate buildings, separate funding mechanisms. Really, those separate systems were developed. Yep. And so it takes a long time to change and those systems to evolve so that we no longer have those. We still have those separate systems in place. And funding is one of those systems, and that creates a barrier. There are other barriers as well. Lots of people say, well, I've tried inclusive education and it hasn't worked for us. You know, my child was bullied, or we didn't get good outcomes, we didn't have a good experience, and we really need access to a safe environment with specialist teachers. So unfortunately, lots of people have had those experiences because the supports weren't in place in that inclusive environment initially. But what we know is it's not really about a specialist place or a separate setting. It's about people. So it's about making sure that we have the people who can provide that specialist support in the schools. So specialist skills that we need for supporting teachers, mainstream teachers or general class teachers, and all children is not synonymous with a separate place, but people still get this sense for there'll be better outcomes, or students who have specialised needs will get better support, a better education in a special setting. But we know that's not necessarily the case.
Now, alongside Flinders colleague Dr. Jane Jarvis, you co-authored a chapter in Australia's first handbook on school-wide positive behaviour support. What's the significance of this tiered approach framework?
So the tiered approach is an approach that we use, or a framework for implementing inclusive education. So when I talked about those systemic barriers that we face, now that we have a tiered framework, it allows us to start to unpack not just the culture and the policies, inclusive policies that we put in place, because many schools have inclusive policies, but what they struggle with is the inclusive practice, and that's the how-to. So the tiered framework has set up systems, and the systems integrate data-based decision-making, providing professional learning to teachers and educators, all staff, so that they know how to implement inclusive practices. And then also the systems that we put in place to make sure children are supported universally, so that's all children get access to multiple level supports or universal supports for everybody. Then we may have small groups of children who might need a little bit more or targeted level support. So that's the second tier. And then we have a very small group who require intensive level support. So that's our tier 3 level intensive supports. And that's the framework that we can now use to implement inclusive education. And that's why it's so significant. That book chapter was really about doing it in terms of behaviour and supporting social, emotional and behavioural supports for all schools. But when we think about multi-tiered systems of support and inclusive education, the framework addresses educational or learning outcomes, social, emotional and behavioural.
Cool. Now, I understand you're working on a project currently with an Adelaide school to implement an inclusive education framework. Are you able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a really exciting project because we've partnered with a school, and our partnership is long-term because we're looking at implementing the 3-tiered framework and developing systems to support educators and that school to implement that inclusive framework. So at the moment, we're just starting. We're working with at the universal level. So we're mostly working with accessibility and working with teachers to implement classroom practices that are inclusive for all children. So that's where we're starting. And then that will continue next year. Then we'll go to a focus on the tier 2 systems and supports. And then the third year will be the focus on the intensive level supports and systems to put in place for all children. That school's really interesting because it's a very large school. It's a B to 12. And they have a very diverse population, cultural diversity, as well as children who have quite complex needs or disability. So it's a really interesting school to work with.
And what sort of results are you expecting from that?
Well, we hope to see good implementation. There's fidelity in terms of what systems and practices need to be put in place. So of course, we're going to measure the fidelity of implementation. But what we really hope to see is some changes in terms of school culture. We'll be looking at school culture. So that means investigating culture in terms of staff, students, families, and how that changes over time. Academic outcomes, learning for children, and focusing on specific areas such as literacy and whether we see changes over time. But also in terms of engagement, student engagement. So we'll be looking at behaviour and student engagement, so looking at attendance and seeing whether there's changes in attendance, and hoping to see a reduction in reporting of behavioural incidents, because as children become more engaged, because we put those adjustments in place and support them with the programs that they need, then what we're likely to see is hopefully a reduction. What we know from the research is children are more engaged, and a reduction in teacher reporting of behavioural incidents.
So what is it that makes you passionate about this sort of area? What motivates you, to keep moving forward?
So I started teaching in special education about 30 years, almost 30 years ago. And I remember going from a mainstream training into a specialist setting that was very separate. It was a residential setting with children, young people with quite complex needs. And I remember walking into that classroom and thinking, wow, I've got so much to learn. I don't know what I'm doing. I've got so much to learn. And from that day, I was passionate about seeing improved outcomes, improved quality of life for those children and their families. And still to this day, I still feel like I have that passion. I've always had an interest in children who have really been quite marginalised from mainstream society. And I still feel quite passionate about that area. And it's evolved, of course.
Yeah.
I work with schools and across a diverse range of children, but I see the potential. I've seen a lot of change over the years, but we've still got such a long way to go. As you mentioned before, we still have separate settings, we've still got special schools, we've still got work to do, and I'm still very passionate about that work. It's just evolved and changed over time.
What is your advice for somebody who wants to pursue a PhD or research in this area?
So at the moment, there's a lot of interest in inclusive education. There has been a lot of media around disability, inclusive communities, and in South Australia now we have an inclusive South Australian agenda and strategy, and you may have heard about inclusive teachers in autism and a state government strategy around that. There's a lot of interest in multiple from multiple different perspectives. But in terms of schools, this is a really exciting time for people to do research, because schools, communities and governments really want to do the right thing, really want to be inclusive, really want to include children and families from all diverse backgrounds, including children with disability. And so what they need help with, or what they want to know, is about the how, and how across a number of different areas. And the framework that I talked about in terms of the multi-tiered systems of support allows for a whole diverse range of areas of research for people who are interested in this area, whether it's around well-being, whether it's around mental health, whether it's around academic improvements for outcomes for children with disability. I mean, there's so much scope, whether it's about behaviour, whether it's about restrictive practices, and making sure that we decrease the overrepresentation of children being suspended and excluded from school. There's such a broad range of interests that now there's so much interest in and funding for, including the PhD scholarships. And in fact, the school that we just talked about, they have funded, so that's our industry funding for a PhD scholarship. So if there's interest in that area, you know, there are scholarships available, and again, you can take up your area of interest as it relates to inclusive education.
Yeah.
So for inclusive education, it's really an exciting time.
Oh, that is absolutely fantastic. Look, it's been an awesome discussion today. I'd like to thank Dr. Julie McMillan for sharing her research journey with us. And now remember, you can watch any of our Fearless Minds episodes on the Flinders YouTube channel, and we hope you can join us for the next one. Thank you once again, and bye for now.